going into a discussion about, I would say, a broad basis of insight that we get, and what about the major learnings for aviation. And that is the key questions. So we have seen on-ground topics, and please join me. Come on. Have a free seat. It's now about getting this on-ground experience transformed into an aviation environment, and it's about learnings for us out of that competences that we have available today. So feel definitely free to join us for any questions. There should be micros around. First of all, I would like to start. I think I identified at least 4 areas that are very interesting for us to discuss. One is about standard open platform and how is that linked to maybe efficiency. The second one I thought of was involving business models. It's about efficiency, revenue, but it's also about experience. The third one is about passenger experience and content. And the last but not least, safety and DRM. So let's maybe start with the first one, because that was, for me, the most impressive and most powerful, about standard open platform architecture and how does that link to efficiency. I would say overcoming proprietary solutions and establishing an open platform standards was a key success factor, as we saw on ground in automotive, in vehicle infotainment, for instance, or BYOD, bring your own device, I think, which is a must-have in future. So why not talking about that first? Because I think it is not easy, and it was, I think, a difficult task or challenge to implement this, because the industry in automotive started also in a different way. And so for me, the question, how did you achieve this? How do you get the buy-in of so many people, of companies, which have very different interests? Maybe, Almond, maybe that's for you.
Yeah, I'd like to, again, sort of share the experience we had in that when we got into the PC business, and if you go back prior to 1980, the world was all about proprietary vertical mainframes. There were companies like IBM, Data General, a few others, but they were vertically driven, and there were really very few choices. And one of the key things that we saw was the idea of a horizontal building block industry, the fact that there were many, many vendors of PCs, that you had options, you had choices. And when you see these things open up to standards that everyone can play to, you invite free competition and you invite innovation. And those things are critical for the success of the industry. And what we've seen is at any one time, when an industry or one company tried to take too much control or create too much of a walled garden, ultimately they can have some short-term success, but long-term, they're ultimately doomed. And it's really been the ability of the industry to see and look for open standards, open capabilities. And as I say, if I were in your position for some of the challenges of the airframe and creating connectivity and a great user experience, because it's so difficult to predict exactly what the trends will be in the next couple of years, you need to stay with open standards, open capabilities that you can scale and remain flexible and not be tied to either any one solution or one vendor.
Are you all here partners of those ecosystems concerning that open platform approach? Is that what you also could share with Cisco?
Yeah, I think Cisco certainly, the work that Lechik is doing in ultraviolet is a perfect example of Cisco's involvement in the standards building approach. From an aviation perspective, there's some new standards around voice over IP for air traffic control, ED 137, 138. And again, Cisco recognises the need for industry standards, so we were heavily involved in that. One of the other things to look at, though, is when you're looking at leading-edge technology and things that are evolving fairly quickly, somehow or other, someone has to actually kick the ball off and start creating those standards. And I think what you'll see in companies like Cisco and obviously Intel, other organisations like that, is they sow the first seeds. And a really good example of this is there's a technology called telepresence. You know, people call it video conferencing on steroids. And about a few years ago, Cisco decided, we're going to go out there and we're going to create this thing called telepresence. And everyone initially saw that as a proprietary video conferencing system that Cisco created. But if you actually have a look at telepresence today, it's actually changed. Cisco made the standards, created them from a start, but actually made them open and invited competition. And now you'll see, you know, we've got competitors out there like Hawaii and a number of others, and they're all out there saying, oh, we've got a much better telepresence solution than Cisco. And it's great. The standards have evolved from those very first seeds that were planted a number of years ago to become industry standards. So as well as being partners within standards bodies, Cisco's also sowing seeds that will eventually become standards.
Okay. Is Ericsson seeing that as also a future requirement?
Well, what we see, there's two levels to a platform. There's the building of the platform, and to a certain degree, that's always going to be unique because the environment to do that, to build it inside an aircraft shell, you know, is different from building it on a ship, for example, is building it from a network. The magic that we start to see is how do you publish that platform to capture the imagination of a developer community? And there's a couple of secrets that we're trying to get ahead of there. One is the technology of choice is open web development technologies of choice. You've got 10 million people who can already code, develop, and it's really friendly and really easy. So to tap into that system actually allows your platform to grow. I mean, the great example of if this, then that, and Belkin is a great example of that. Before they did that, it was devices that were kind of smart. After they did that, it was devices that could be included in recipes that then could go viral. And that was what captured the audience's imagination, funnily enough. When we lived that kind of thing, you'll never imagine those things on your own. But if you imagine taking a fleet and saying, okay, we open up our fleet to you, what could you do? Amazon, what could you do if you wanted to retail across our fleet? Here is the platform, you know, the APIs we expose. It could possibly be an interesting journey, I would suggest.
I would be quite interested also in the view on airlines or studios. How do they see that? Or do you have any question on that? How that is conflicting or supporting your business?
Actually, I would like to be a little bit controversial here for a moment. Why not, right? Each approach has its own advantages and disadvantages. So sometimes proprietary systems, closed systems, have certain advantages that other systems don't. Look at Apple. Ability to integrate the entire ecosystem end to end allowed them to create very, very quickly incredible consumer experience because they had full control over absolutely everything. Now, having said that, open Android platform allows innovation. So people are using Android for all sorts of things that we didn't think about. Developing new board computers, developing those computers for control of automation at home and other places, and now figuring out how to integrate it all together. And it's much less expensive at the same time. So we shouldn't always completely reject one versus the other. Depending on what we're trying to do, one might actually have advantage.
I'll just come back on this because there's something that this is a really good point, and it touches on this question of core business and understanding what your core business is. Apple's core business is a hardware platform that they want to maximize the value of. So you join that ecosystem and buy devices across the board. If you want to go against Apple, you try and copy their hardware platform, and apparently costs you about $1 billion in court in San Jose. Google does not sell hardware. Google, core business, advertising. They give away their R&D to actually increase their relevance in the hope of their inventory is going to increase. If you go after Google's advertising system, then they will take you to court and they will kill you. So there's a great saying that I heard actually. Amazon is retail. They give away Kindles under manufacturing price, right, to increase their retail channel. Their core business is retail. The complement is the channel, the device. I heard a great thing from a guy once. He said, the new form of open is closed. All these companies pretend to be open until you understand their core business, and then they'll attack you if you ever try and get close to that.
I think that brings me to the next point. We are talking about, I think, mainly about business models that could be supported by such an open platform. And the profit that you gain out of that is depending strongly on what your business model is about. Any views on that?
In your particular situation, just like any media distribution, and that's what I'm focusing on, there are really two sides of that business model, and actually within each of them there are even additional areas. So on one hand, it's a business model with content providers themselves. How do you acquire that content? Who do you acquire it from? Under what circumstances? And then the consumer side of it as well, and quite possibly other elements of the ecosystem, hardware providers, for example, advertisers, etc. So looking at that business model without taking into consideration all of those different elements is a little bit short-sighted potentially. Let me give you an example. If you're looking at sell-through model, where actually you want to sell movies to your passengers, your agreement with the studios is going to be completely different than if you go into much later windows and you're actually renting that movies or make them ad-supported. Potentially, if there is hardware involved that you directly support or not support on the plane, you can have additional agreements with hardware providers for preferential treatment of that hardware. People were talking about big data. The amount of data that airline industry is probably collecting, which I don't even dare to imagine how much is probably just incredible about me, about every other passenger, but about the flights, about weather, about pretty much anything. A lot of advertising that's being done is done not only in context of me and my personal preferences, but me and my personal preferences at any given time, at different phases of my life, at different interests in my life. If I'm looking for a house, or if I'm planning vacation, or if I'm going on vacation, very, very different opportunities for advertising. And you have access to a lot of that data. There are privacy issues, as I mentioned before, but many of them are quite solvable. There are distributors that are willing to share revenue with you and provide content for you to distribute, where you don't pay even for the content, but actually get revenue from them. So there are so many different facets of that that you actually could think about that are really worth considering in this entirety.
Would you say that the benefits are coming out more out of generation done, or is it more about getting the costs down by transferring them maybe back to the passengers?
Well, it's definitely both. I have no idea how much it costs you, for example, to load all of those portable players that we get on the plane once a month or however often you do that. I would imagine, considering how many of those portable players you have to preload with content and maintain, it's pretty significant cost. Just not having to do that and doing it just to the server on the flight, on the plane, I would imagine is already pretty significant saving. then not having to maintain those devices, not having to buy those devices, etc., that's significant cost. But then there's potential for incremental revenue as well. So it's both.
One of the things that we mentioned earlier was the concept of the change in the contract at the moment. Instead of the contract existing between the airline and the content provider, to actually move that contract to the passenger and the content provider. We're right at a cusp where we're actually seeing that change happen now. The classic example is I can go to McDonald's and I can watch a movie at McDonald's while I'm eating my burger. Why can't I do it on my aeroplane? The piece that they miss out in that discussion is I can go to McDonald's and I can buy my movie to watch while I'm eating my burger at McDonald's. It's that and buy piece that is becoming the norm. Any 17 to 25-year-old now has this expectation that they will buy the movie. The airline industry hasn't quite grasped that this change is occurring now where the next generation, they'll expect to pay. What we've got to do now is grasp the opportunity to change the operating model, to put that in place, flick the old model, move over to a new model where it's the contract is shifted.
Good point. So are there any airlines out here that can imagine getting a retailer or a distributor instead of a buyer of content? No? I think could help. Any questions on that topic concerning these roles that could change, new business models that come up? No?
Before I came here, I actually talked to a few different studios, just hypothetically about different business models related actually in particular to ultraviolet in this case. So for example, let's say I own rights, I bought a license to be precise, but let's say I bought a movie and I would like to watch it on the plane. Would there be a charge, for example, to airline industry to load that movie on the server? And it's interesting because, depending on the studio, you will get a little bit different answers about that. But what I noticed, there is an obvious willingness to consider many different options under many different circumstances. So if you, for example, expand your role into a retailer where you're selling as well rights, all of a sudden they are much more willing to consider maybe giving you more freedom in other areas and maybe not charging you for certain things. So there's a lot that's happening right now that gives a lot of flexibility and options.
Okay. Armand?
I would like to make the point that the time is now, in that the airplane for the foreseeable future will have to be a hybrid model, meaning that connectivity may not always be available. So there will be a need for a resident server, and you're looking at 200 to 300 passengers per plane easily. You have a unique retail opportunity that, historically they would put an aisle down the row and they would try to sell you things like duty-free in certain situations. That needs to be upscaled. The airline industry needs to be talking to Amazon.com, to Netflix, other providers that would be willing to look at your server as another option for their retail footprint. And it's securing those relationships and defining that footprint now while you are in what we often refer to as an inflection point or a transition, moving from the old proprietary seatback model to one that's more open. It's forming those relationships now and establishing, and frankly, there's a little bit of muscle there that you have in that you can bring a large contained retail population to these markets that aren't currently being addressed in the traditional, methodologies, and it's a unique capability. And so I think those that form those relationships, establish those user model now, will be well positioned in the future.
Any comments, questions on that? For me, the next step is also about experience, of course, of that. Passenger experience, as we found actually in trend and market research, the passenger preferences are continuing from on-ground experience to the on-board experience. They want to use the same toys, they want to use look at the same movies, they watch Their games, free of choice, quite seamless. I think that's what we experience more and more on the ground, and that's what passengers would like to extend also to the aircraft. Is that necessary, question mark, for us to provide solutions like that? Is that possible, as we just heard, because we will probably have a hybrid model? I think today's technology is not really available to deliver enough bandwidth for doing that all online. So I think hybrid model is a good approach. Anyhow, what do you think about that, extending that experience?
I think there's probably no way around that. The seamlessness that's expected between the on-ground life and the few hours you spend in a plane. And I think the same happened in your living room already. I mean, in the past, your TV had a built-in tuner, and those were the programs you got. Then you got a cable box or a set-top box, satellite box, and the secondary TV somewhere else had different programs because it might not have been connected to that. But today it's expected that everything is available everywhere. Apps are running on TVs, they're just another screen, and you're sitting maybe in front of them with two other screens in your hands and doing things simultaneously. And that became totally natural, so nobody's even thinking about that anymore. And I think this is, for me at least, the way it will also happen in the plane, in the airline industry. I think the expectations are already there. At the moment, people don't really have a choice, but sooner or later, there will be choice provided.
And in terms of connectivity, Geoff, is that do you see limits?
The interesting question going through my mind, just reflecting on this, I can't think of another environment that I spend time in where I have no choice at all. I have to sit there for 3 hours, so I'm a completely captive audience. And I'd love to kind of know how much research we've done of asking those people, what is it that you'd like to do when you are in that captive audience scenario? And some of those things you'll be able to preempt, and the question is how to do that most economically efficiently and bandwidth efficiently. Some of it won't be possible yet, but there's going to be a moving bar in the middle where the stuff that's not possible will become possible, but there's probably a lot that we can preempt that we already know could be done. And I'll go back. People's behaviors are changing. People are walking on now with screens and devices that can provide their own entertainment. We had screens on the back of seats before because people didn't have screens for their own entertainment and it was channeled. The reality is that you will never provide me a better experience than the one that's going to come through the device that I've chosen and I prefer works the way that I want to. So I think it's a little bit, the question starts with understanding what people want. They are captive, so they're a lot more flexible. They're a great monetary endpoint because if you haven't got anything else to do, I know I'd probably sit there and browse Amazon electronics. If I haven't got anything else thinking about it, if it would help me in some way to go through that path. And you'll reinvent that experience and probably take cost structure out. Just because we put screens on the back of seats now doesn't mean we have to put screens on the back of the seats in the future to provide the wanted experience.
When you're thinking about a seamless experience, it's way beyond, can I watch the same content that I watched at home or in any other place? It's really about what actually we are already seeing from telcos, from cable companies and others is already happening. I want to start watching on one device, but then I want to continue watching on a different device. I don't want to have to fast forward to the spot where I stopped watching it. I want to actually completely seamlessly restart. And that goes back to the open systems, it goes back to the entire ecosystem, it goes back to connectivity, how do you exchange the data between all of those different elements of the system, how do you recognize the person that it's really that person, and therefore the video should start at this particular moment. Then you start getting into things like what's happening already, which is how do you introduce interactivity into some of the content. We are much more used to gaming being separate from linear video. That world is starting to merge in some forms of entertainment more and more. Will you be able to provide some of that interactivity that they are looking for? So, for example, simple things like chaptering of the video that is being introduced. How does it work with a system that's partially on the plane but partially communicating to the systems on the ground? So all of those things become part of that seamless experience.
And I've just thought of another thing, actually, that we can comment. One of the emotions that people are getting excited about in the future is being self-controlled. We actually like doing things ourselves and being in control and in charge. And in the cable industry, one of the most horrible experiences is getting a cable box installed. You have to wait for the guy never shows up, it's 3 hours, it doesn't work. The cable industry is trying to re-engineer that process so that you can do it yourself. It does two things. It takes the cost away from them, and actually people prefer the experience because they can do it and they're in control. So there's a scenario here that says that I'm receiving something. I mean, I have 2 children. We've been flying since, they've been flying since 3 months old. If we received an email that said, control your own experience on board, kind of like, do you want to have your own content available, your own games available, kind of like what devices you have, and I can menu choose that, I'd see that as a very positive thing, because now it's taken the unknown out of me. Now I know 8 hours from Dallas to London, actually I know exactly how I'm going to manage the kids during that journey, and it's taken cost out of the system.
So I think self-control is great. Sometimes remote control is better. I would love to have one of those now. Maybe motivate one of you to ask some questions. Oh, here's one. Please. Very welcome.
Yes, hello. Doug Backlund from American Airlines. I'd like to first thank Kevin Bremer and the Educational Committee for bringing us some really fascinating speakers here this morning. Really enjoyed it. Thank you. My question is for the gentleman from Intel. I was fascinated by your commentary about the auto industry and coalescing around an open standard, open architecture solution. I think we in our industry have made some inconsistent strides towards that nirvana, if you will. And I think that's a really intriguing example. Could you comment a little bit about what was the catalyst for the auto industry to do that? And secondly, I believe I noticed that perhaps Ford was not on that list. So what's your view will happen to the outliers that are not part of that effort?
All right. Well, first off, the car has also been an area. It's one of the last environmental spaces that we have not really completely computerized or created the internet experience. And we think we're on the cusp of that. And frankly, it's really been about connectivity. And with LTE, WiMAX was thought to have maybe been an option, but it looks like with the advances of LTE bandwidth and connectivity as we get into 4G networking, that the auto experience will really be able to take on a full internet. Now, what had happened is we had found that when we tried to get involved in different auto companies, everybody was always looking for their unfair share or how they could corner the market. And I think the comment earlier, the new open is really closed, and there's a lot of truth in that. And you've really got to dig in and look at everyone's agenda and situation. And what we found is that we want to ship, and I mean, we ship hundreds of millions of microprocessors. And to do that, we have to do it in open standards. And while one auto company is interesting business to us, when you look at the cost of making these new fabs, and by the way, before we even start making wafers, we are into the billions of capital to just get that manufacturing facility up and running. So for us to take on a new industry, it needs to be bigger than just one car company committing their business to us. We need open standards so that they all play together. Now, initially, did they all think that was great? Hey, come together and sort of have to give up a little bit to be a happy family? No. They all came kind of thinking, I'll go in and sort of pretend I'm one of the family, but I'm going to look for my own niche. And that's okay. And at the end of the day, differentiation at some level is a requirement. But at the same time, they all want to drink from the same set of standards and be able to draw from the same work pool and supplier set. You're absolutely correct. Ford is not a part of the community today. Yet at the same time, they do buy from suppliers that are influenced by the IVI community and the Geneva Alliance. So, you know, they're not necessarily right there giving their front-level participation, but do they benefit? Yes. And, you know, do we all benefit at some level through the ecosystem? And I would say yes again. But yeah, there's always instances where not everybody's going to jump in. But what we've got is enough critical mass to where the industry is actually seeing a benefit. And as I say, we started off with about 100 companies. We're up to 160. And, you know, it's just the snowball gaining momentum. And long term, we see it as a real positive. And what it's really about, it's about the software. And that is really, you know, in almost any of these activities, that becomes one of the biggest challenges, is building a software base that doesn't tie you in, that doesn't create the open-closed system. And that's really what Geneva's about.
Actually, probably DECE or ultraviolet is also an interesting example on how it worked. And I would say that there were some external factors and then specific to internal DECE factors that made it so successful. So externally, media companies have been dealing with the problem of declining revenue from home entertainment. So they really had a common goal. What do we do about that, right? How do we deal with that? How can we overcome some of those issues? They realized digital is the way to go, but then all right, so Apple introduced its own products to iTunes, but that's not enough. That doesn't create sufficient market penetration and growth to address all of the issues. So that was the external driver. But then there were a couple of people who really envisioned what that future could be like, and they were from the studios, and they were a little bit like typical entrepreneurs. They truly believed that it's going to work, and they kept driving it relentlessly. It took a little bit of time. You know, the first year was really tough. It was not going almost anywhere, and then all of a sudden, more and more people started signing up for the behind the idea, and started gaining a little bit of momentum. But then, again, there were some really smart organizational things that they did that made it successful. They realized that this really needs to be driven by business needs more than by the technology. So the way DECE or ultraviolet works is we have few separate working groups. There's a business working group, technology working group, and legal working group. And business working group is the one that try to determine the direction as much as possible, but at the same time taking obviously input from the other groups. So on a regular basis, we'll get something all of a sudden from technical working group saying, hey, there's this problem all of a sudden that's popping up based on the current experience, the way consumers are using it. For example, we think these are possible solutions, but each of them will have repercussion. That goes thrown into the business working group, and we try to determine it purely from the business point of view, consumer experience, needs of the market, etc. What is the best, fastest approach to make it successful? We start making those decisions, throw it back to technical and legal for approval, and to tell us, sorry, it won't work that way, back to the drawing board every once in a while. But it's driven mainly by the market needs, the business needs of the current market.
Great. Thanks for the question. I use the tool again. Maybe it works again. Any other question? I think we have time for one more, please. Come back.
Yes, hello, I'm Gunilla Eitelmäki. I work for Scandinavian Airlines. I totally agree with what you say, that it is important with connectivity. It's a little bit different in which continent you live on. If you have air to ground or satellite communications, so just leave it aside. What I would like to know from you more on the overall thing is that as an airline, we are kind of squeezed in between. We know exactly what we want. We have the same nice visions that you have. But somehow, whatever you put on an aircraft, either it has to be approved by the airframer, not an easy thing to do, because there is this big thing that has to be changed, all these regulations. And we have the authorities that are regulating whatever you put in. And I have a feeling that everything that is new technology is not really the best competence, so to say. Sorry if there is anyone from FAA or EASA in here, but it takes time. And the passenger, they think, well, connectivity, I connect, it's easy. Why don't you have it? They write me mails. Why don't you have it? And they don't see all these long periods of getting certification. So how are you working together within the airframers and also towards authorities that are going to approve it finally, so that we can give things to our passengers? And I'm talking about putting in hardware, whatever it is, in the aircraft.
Very good point. Hard to address. Maybe Ted can take that.
Thanks very much. I actually think this is a really good question for Airbus to address, and I think Ingo would be a really good idea. Actually, what you talk about, obviously the FAA is a particularly onerous example, but most industries have something similar. So, for example, I mentioned before the new standards for voice for air traffic control. We had to go through exactly the same thing through. So we had to develop the standards then had to go through various approvals before they could eventually be implemented. Fact of life, that's what we have to live with. But what we're trying to do is actually build a working model that we can then take to the regulators and say, this is what the expectations are. What we'd like to do is establish a platform. And it's what I tried to get across earlier with the architecture. If we can actually establish a platform and get the platform approved with as little equipment on board the aircraft as possible, and that platform can evolve without changes to hardware, primarily software changes as it evolves through, it takes away that need for reapproval to some extent over time. But certainly we accept that has to be done, and that has been factored into the models that we're building.
Yeah, a good point. Take it back. I think that is a difficult question, and it takes longer than in other industries. But we also know why, because I think we have a higher level of safety that we have to achieve in aircrafts, and that's why it should take time, but I think it's not impossible. I think we have a very good quality of technology available on ground. I think that should be sufficient, but I think the first step is to create a demand and get a buy-in of a community like that, in Apex, for instance. They say, yes, that's what we're going to go for, and then we can achieve it. And actually, this was also the idea about the whole panel, that we create new insights to drive our business forward. And I think we are at the end of a very long session, and for me, the journey really was about creating that future perspective together. I know it's, I think, a disruptive topic, that needs to be discussed further on. This was only a starting point. For me, there are quite a visionary topics that we should address and carry on, like seamless connectivity on ground and on board. That should be possible. Improve passenger experience on lower cost level. I think would be beneficial for us all. And done and delivered probably by a common open platform standard. So that, for me, is the way forward. And at that point, I want to thank everybody of the panel for creating that perspective together with us, giving us your insights. I really enjoyed it. And a real pleasure, and hope that also you enjoyed that learning journey in a different industry and take some insights with you and not stop thinking here, just carried it on, and hope we started that thinking about that. So thank you very much.